Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy my videos. I'm currently growing the channel and I'm getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, so it would mean the world to me if you could support me. And today we're going to be talking about Quintorius Loremaster, and if you don't know what he does, for 3 colorless, 1 red and 1 white, it's a legendary creature, Elephant Cleric, 3/5 with Vigilance, and at the beginning of your end step, exile target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token, and 1 colorless, 1 red and 1 white, tap, sacrifice a spirit, choose target card, exiled with Quintorius. You may cast that card this turn without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of your library instead. So when I first saw this card, I was very unimpressed, as I imagine most of you were. I thought, meh, this is a pretty niche and kind of random effect, very slow. But me and my buddy were playing in Sealed recently, and this absolutely kicked our asses when our opponent dropped it, and the Vigilance was really annoying, and then he kept making a 3/2 every turn, and it got me thinking whether it could be decent in Commander. And then I read the card again carefully, and I realized that this is actually really strong with certain kind of effects, particularly with planeswalkers, enchantments, and artifacts that can sacrifice themselves to put themselves into the graveyard. Because Quintorius' ability will only put the card at the bottom of the library if it goes to the graveyard as it's resolving. But then once it's in play, it doesn't remember that ability, so if the permanent just goes to the graveyard later on at some point, you can get to reuse it over and over and over, turn after turn after turn. So as you'll see, we have quite a few cards in the deck built to abuse that interaction, and honestly I think he's a very fun commander overall. He can be really strong even though he is quite slow, but the cool thing is the cards exiled with Quintorius remember that you exiled them with him, so if you cast him later on again, he gets to reuse them, and if you have a way to give him haste, he can do that immediately. Honestly, I think he's pretty solid, and I'm really excited about this deck list because it's so out of the box. So without further ado, let's get started, and we're starting off with Anger. Anger's going to be pretty decent in this deck. We have a lot of ways to dump it into our graveyard, and that's going to help Quintorius use his ability whenever he comes into play, as long as there's something exiled and we control a spirit. Bothersome Quasit is going to be fantastic here because we have so many non-creature spells, and this is going to protect us by forcing our opponents to attack each other. Jeru with Eyes Open is going to work great in this deck because we do have a few planeswalkers that all work really well with what the deck wants to be doing, and they also give us a little bit of utility, so this can kind of act a bit as a toolbox. Drogskor Reinforcements works really well with the spirits that Quintorius is creating. It's going to give them melee, which means they can end the game in a hurry, but also crucially it prevents all non-combat damage that will be dealt to spirits you control. So we have quite a few board wipes that are damage based. That means that we can build our own one-sided board wipes. Pretty sweet. Goblin Engineer is fulfilling a few purposes. So firstly, it can search one of our really strong artifacts such as Portal to Phyrexia for Quintorius to exile, and then obviously he can play it for free. But then later on this can just sacrifice an artifact and return something better from our graveyard to the battlefield, which is pretty nice. Guardian's Scale Lord gives us great recursion and utility. We have so many good non-land permanents that this should be getting us value every single time. Lelia the Blade Reforged is going to work really well with Quintorius' ability. It's probably only going to trigger once or twice per turn, but she also triggers herself, so this should grow quite big quite quickly. Manaform Hellcat is going to be one of our main offensive cards. We're going to get creatures that we get to attack with immediately, which is very nice. It can also be used defensively with instants to blow out our opponents. Milliken is a decent ramp card that also fills our graveyard, which are both things we want to be doing. Monastery Mentor is going to be great and can snowball very quickly if left unattended. It's also super cheap now, so it's definitely a good time to pick one of these up. Nayali Sun's Vanguard is going to work pretty well with all the tokens we're creating, not just with our commander but with all our other cards. His second ability remains active even if he is removed, so we will still be able to play those cards even if Nayali dies. Ojutai Exemplars is a very flexible one that can enable some decent attacks by tapping. This is one that people feel is often a little bit underpowered, but the tapping ability can be pretty relevant in Commander, since a lot of the time people leave enough creatures up to block what's on board, but they're not necessarily prepared for a sudden tap effect. The Lifelink and First Strike can also be really good, and with our instance it can protect itself as well. Stonebound Mentor is going to scry at least once per turn with Quintorius, but probably quite a bit more because we have quite a few cards that are doing stuff with our graveyard. Sun Titan just provides some nice repeatable recursion that can keep our game plan going, and Vindictive Flamestoker is one that maybe doesn't look that strong but is actually very good. We'll be putting counters on him very easily, and then we get to discard our hand, thus filling our graveyard, and then draw a ton of cards, and it should be pretty cheap to do so if we've played a bunch of non-creature spells. spells. We can also recur this very easily with Sun Titan and Guardian Scale Lord, so very solid card. Moving on, we have our artifacts. Commander's Sphere is an interesting one because it gets itself into the graveyard naturally, so it works pretty well if we don't have anything else to exile. Idol of Oblivion is going to draw us cards very easily thanks to Quintorius. Lightning Greaves should hopefully protect Quintorius and allow him to use his ability immediately. Patriarch's Seal is going to allow us to use Quintorius' ability twice instead of just once. Portal to Phyrexia is one of the best late game cards in the deck. We can play it for super cheap with Quintorius, but we can also straight up cast it. And if we want to reuse its sacrifice ability, we can sacrifice it with stuff like Goblin Engineer in order to get that trigger over and over, and then it allows us to finish the game quite quickly by reanimating our opponent's creatures. Rings of Bright Hearth works really well with Quintorius and also with all of the Planeswalkers we have in the deck. So one of the main interactions in the deck is Gideon, ally of Xenagor, giving us a ton of emblems that just stick around for the rest of the game. With Rings of Bright Hearth out, we can copy his ability and get 2 emblems and start the train rolling. Swiftfoot Boots is more protection for Quintorius. And moving on, we have Instance Benevolent Offering is pretty spicy in this deck because it makes spirit tokens, which are really good. It can give our life total a nice padding by gaining us at least 6 life, but probably a lot more. And we can always give the effects to the opponents that can use them least. Big Score is going to refill our hands and fill our graveyard. Fantastic in this deck. Boros Charm is protection for our board. The Thartic Pyre is great because both modes are pretty decent. Killing a small creature is fine, but looting an instant speed is what we really want to be doing most of the time. Delayed Blast Fireball is a fantastic board wipe that works so well with Quintorius because when we play it for free with him, we're playing it from exile. Fantastic in this deck. Lorehold Combatant does a lot of stuff that we're interested in. It makes spirits, which is nice, and it can also pump all of our creatures and give them indestructible, which is good against board wipes. It also gets to remove something and gain us some life if we want to. And then finally, we can sacrifice one of the things we want to put into our graveyard and draw 2 cards. All of these modes are pretty decent, so this is great in this deck. Release to Memory makes a ton of spirits to make sure we always have fuel for Quintorius. And it's also Graveyard Hate, which is really good. Sajiri Celtic is going to give nice protection for our commander. Thrill of Possibility is a decent card draw spell that fills up our graveyard. Devil's Trickery is one of the only ways that red decks can interact on the stack, so this is great to have. And Unexpected Windfall is another big score effect. Moving on, we have Sorceries. Blasphemous Act is a board wipe that's very good in this deck because we have a few ways to give our creatures protection from non-combat damage. Faithless Looting is great to fill up our graveyard. Reconstruct History is going to be huge in this deck. It could be a 5-for-1 in the right situation. Drawing 5 cards for 4 mana and all of them being relevant is fantastic. Seize the Spoils is going to fill up our graveyard and ramp us a little bit. Very nice. Soulfire Eruption is a really interesting finisher in this deck because we can get to use it twice thanks to Quintorius. It's very random, but it can deal a ton of damage and effectively draws a ton of cards, so it's pretty good. Thrilling Discovery is great because it pads our life total a little bit and then fills up our graveyard very nicely whilst drawing us cards. Triumphant Reckoning returns all artifact enchantments and planeswalkers from our graveyard. This should be very solid in our deck. For enchantments, we have Bitter Reunion, which is usually a pretty decent card just on the front side, but then being able to sacrifice it and recur it with Quintorius is really good because this is loopable. It doesn't get exiled because of his ability. Court of Grace is a nice way to draw cards, and in this deck we don't care too much whether we get the Angel or not because the Spirit is also pretty good. A 1/1 Spirit is fine to sacrifice to Quintorius. Table of the Mirror Breaker does a lot of stuff that we wanted to do. We're getting 2/2s that make treasure tokens, that's great. Discarding cards into the graveyard is fantastic. And the flip side can even give us a little bit of value too if we need it to. Lorehold Excavation can very slowly whittle down our opponent's life total while padding ours, and it's also going to fill our graveyard. The second ability isn't going to come up too often because we don't have that many creatures in the deck, but the milling and the life gain and the life loss is probably good enough to play it anyway. Passionate Archaeologist is a good way to start getting the ball rolling towards finishing the game. It's going to deal a lot of damage with Quintorius. The Brothers' War works very well here. Getting 2 Power Stone tokens is good because we have a lot of artifacts and we have quite a few activated abilities as well, including on our commander. Forcing our opponents to attack each other is obviously great, and then dealing a lot of damage equal to the artifacts we control can end the game in a hurry. Finally, for enchantments, we have the Restoration of Igonjo. First, it finds us the land, which is great. Then it can fill up our graveyard whilst recurring something, which is obviously awesome. And then on the flip side, it makes spirit tokens, so this card just fits so well in this deck. Next up, we have Planeswalkers. Chandra Flamecaller is going to put on the pressure a little bit with the +1. Then her 0 ability, which draws us cards while filling our graveyard, is great, but we mostly want it for the -X ability, which can put us straight into the graveyard whilst wiping the board, which means we can recur her multiple times with Quintorius. Directly Scrap Savant once again fills up our graveyard whilst drawing us cards, and it can also loop some artifacts from the graveyard. Gideon, ally of Zendikar, is the main reason I made this deck. This guy is amazing in this deck. We can get an emblem immediately. That's going to be for the rest of the game, and then we can just recur him with Quintorius once per turn, do the same thing over and over, keep getting an emblem a turn, and our opponents are going to have to deal with this because otherwise it's emblem after emblem after emblem, and if we have Rings of Brighthearth out, we can even double that every time, so getting 2+1/+1 emblems every single turn seems pretty awesome to me. The Eternal Wanderer has a board wipe built in, so it's great. If she ever gets killed, we just get to recur her. Really good in this deck. And the Wanderer is going to prevent non-combat damage to our creatures, which works well with our board wipes, and then it's also going to deal with our opponent's big creatures. For invasions, we have Invasion of Gobakan. The front side is some pretty decent interaction, but the flip side is where it's at. It's going to give us some nice board wipe protection that is recurable thanks to Quintorius. Invasion of Kaldheim fills up our graveyard whilst refueling our hand, and on the flip side, it becomes a removal and card advantage machine. Invasion of Karsus is another decent board wipe that we can protect our creatures from with a bunch of different things, and then the flip side is going to be a creature that's going to kill our opponents really fast, so they're going to have to deal with it, but when they do, we can just recur the front side again with Quintorius, and this is very powerful. Invasion of Mercadia is going to fill up a graveyard and draw us cards. That's what we want, and then on the flip side, it can put a little bit of pressure on our opponents, again whilst filling our graveyard and giving our creatures haste. Pretty decent. For land, we have Emergence Zone. This is really good because we can actually play the stuff that we exile with Quintorius at instant speed if we have this out. That can help a lot. Gaia Reach Sanitarium is great to fill up our graveyard, and Roadside Reliquary is going to be pretty solid in a deck with this many artifacts and enchantments. So there you have it. That is my Quintorius Loremaster deck tech. I'm really proud of this one because I think it's such a cool and interesting commander with so many out-of-the-box abilities. Do you agree? Do you think there's any cards I missed or any changes you would make? Do let me know in the comment section below if there is any commander from March of the Machine that you would like me to do a deck tech on next. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!